So if you guys have ever gone to the grocery store and stared aimlessly at the endless supply of eggs that they have on the shelf and wondered which one of them is actually best, this video is going to be for you. We're going to be taking a super deep dive into the difference between conventional eggs, cage-free eggs, free-range eggs, as well as pasture-raised eggs, and how these are actually classified. And so let's go ahead and dive in. Now, my wife and I have just recently started raising chickens here in the city that we live in, which has been quite the experience. However, it has really opened up our eyes to the difference between how you're supposed to raise chickens for the purpose of egg laying and how they are typically raised for the purpose of egg laying. And there is a massive difference between those two things. And it's really opened up the door for there to be several different types of classifications when it comes to eggs. You have conventional, you have cage-free, free-range, and pasture-raised, and they are all very, very distinct classifications when it comes to the eggs that are produced through those methods. Now, the first classification that I want to talk about is simply conventionally produced eggs. And typically speaking, these are eggs that are laid by chickens that essentially spend their entire life in a cage. These types of eggs are laid by chickens that spend their entire life in a warehouse where there are just rows and rows and rows of chickens in cages that are just simply laying eggs for their entire life and just sitting in a cage. Now, I'm not typically the animal activist type of person. However, it is interesting to note that even companies like McDonald's will refuse to use conventional eggs because of the conditions of the chickens that are laying those eggs. Now, when it comes to the diet that these chickens are being fed, it largely consists of soy, corn, a nutritional vitamin supplement, as well as antibiotics. Now, obviously, this isn't the best diet in the world, but it is worth noting that it's also not the worst diet in the world. And the reason for that is that technically these types of chickens, even though they have terrible living conditions, are at least being fed a nutritionally dense diet that is optimized for egg laying. So they are getting enough protein, enough vitamins and minerals, as well as other nutrients that are absolutely needed for the production of nutrient-dense eggs. And so even though conventionally produced eggs are produced by chickens that don't have good living conditions, they do produce at least decent eggs. However, because the diet of these chickens isn't a natural diet or a diet that they would inherently consume in a more natural setting, their diet does somewhat affect the amino acid profile, the lipid profile, as well as the vitamin and mineral profile of the eggs that are produced. Now, again, this doesn't mean that these eggs are just completely garbage. It just means that they're different than what they would be in a more natural setting. Now, the shells of conventionally produced eggs are typically white, and a lot of people just assume that this means that they're worse than brown-shelled eggs, but the only reason that conventionally produced eggs are white is because of the type of breed of chicken that is used in conventionally produced eggs. And when you see that distinct brown shell in the other types of eggs, this simply means that they're using a different breed of chicken, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually a better egg. Now, when you look at the yolk of a conventionally produced egg, it usually has a very distinct yellow tint to it, and the reason for this is that there's a very specific carotenoid that's found in soy and corn that makes its way into the yolk of these eggs and gives it that very distinct yellow tint. Now, people typically assume that because they're yellow, they have less nutrients in them. However, this isn't necessarily the case. Now, it does signify that these types of chickens are not being fed leafy greens and bugs, which is how they get that more orange tint to the yolk. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's less nutrients in them, but this is something that we'll talk about more in depth here in a minute. Now, if for some reason you're at the store and you're looking for a conventionally produced egg, about the only way to know if it is conventionally produced is one, if it has a white shell, which sometimes isn't always the case. Sometimes conventionally produced eggs do have a brown shell. However, the best way to know is just simply if it's not labeled anything else. If it's not labeled free range or cage free or pasture raised, it's probably going to be a conventionally produced egg. Now, the next classification of eggs that is becoming very popular these days, especially around fast food restaurants, is cage free eggs. And this does sound a lot better than the conventionally caged birds that are producing the eggs in a more conventional manner. However, it's worth noting that the living standards of the chickens that are cage-free really isn't that much better than the caged birds. These chickens are usually just crammed into some massive warehouse, and there are thousands upon thousands of chickens in these large warehouses. However, they're still in super close quarters. And so even though it's really great that they're not raised in cages, there's only a marginal improvement over a conventionally produced egg. And when it comes to the nutrition or the egg quality of a cage-free egg, the quality of the egg isn't that much better either. And the reason for this is that, yes, even though these chickens are not being raised in a cage, they're still being fed the exact same thing as a conventionally produced egg. This means that they're getting largely a diet that consists of corn and soy, synthetic vitamin and mineral supplements, as well as antibiotics. And because of this, produces almost an identical egg to a conventionally produced egg. Now, interestingly enough, the shell of cage-free eggs is usually brown to kind of give the consumer the illusion that the egg is of better quality. However, the only reason that the egg is brown isn't because of the nutritional quality of the food, but it's because of the breed of bird that is being used to lay that egg. And so the only real difference between a conventionally produced egg and the cage-free egg is the experience of the chicken. And at best, it's an only marginal improvement over a conventional egg. And so I really don't see the point of spending the extra money for a cage-free egg over a conventionally produced egg. And this is what brings us to the next classification of eggs, which is free range, which represents the first of two classifications of birds that actually have access to the outdoors. However, because the regulations surrounding what can be considered a free range egg are so loose, and because they're only required to have 2 to 4 square feet of outdoor access, it's actually entirely possible that even free-range eggs that are supposed to have access to the outdoors actually never even step foot outdoors. Free-range eggs are only actually required to simply have access to the outdoors, and because it's such a small space, a lot of egg producers will simply just give the chickens like a window to stick their head out of into a 2 to 4 square foot space, which means a lot of these chickens don't even ever see the outdoors. And so even though free range eggs are technically supposed to have access to the outdoors, this isn't always necessarily the case. However, where free range eggs do differ from cage-free and conventional eggs is that free range eggs are not allowed antibiotics. And so this is kind of the first classification that actually starts to regulate what the chickens are and are not able to be fed. But with that being said, the free-range chickens are still typically largely fed a conventional diet of soy, corn, and vitamins. Yes, they do have access to the outdoors and theoretically could forage in some certain situations. However, most of their diet does simply consist of corn, soy, and vitamins. And so even though free-range birds don't consume any antibiotics, that's typically about the only difference between a free-range egg and a conventional egg. But a lot of different egg producers have actually wised up to this and the expectation that the consumer has for a higher quality egg in a free-range egg, and a lot of these producers will now add in specific carotenoids into the diet of these eggs in order to give the yolk a richer orange hue to it, which does convince the consumer that's a more nutritionally dense egg, and that the birds did actually have access to bugs and grasses and things of that nature. However, more often than not, a free-range egg is simply simply a conventional egg with a little bit of carotenoids in it to darken the yolk. And this is in stark contrast to our last classification of eggs, which is pasture-raised eggs. Now, pasture-raised chickens have access to over 108 square feet of outdoor space when compared to a free-range egg that only has access to 2 to 4 square feet of outdoor space. And because of this dramatically affects the diet of a pasture-raised chicken. A pasture-raised chicken actually has enough outdoor space to naturally forage for bugs and leafy greens like they would in a more natural setting. The preferred diet of a chicken is first bugs, second leafy greens, and then third grains and seeds. And when you compare this to the diet of a conventional or cage-free or free-range bird that is primarily being fed a seed and grain-based diet, there is a massive difference between the diet of a pasture-raised chicken and a conventional chicken. Now, the main thing that the diet of the chicken affects isn't necessarily the nutrient density per se of the egg on paper, but it does influence the amino acid profile, the lipid profile, namely the omega-3 content, but it also affects the nutrient profile. And so even though, again, a pasture-raised egg doesn't have more nutrients in it, it does have a different distribution of nutrients. Now, the yolks of pasture-raised eggs also typically have a very distinct orange tint to them, and the reason for this is because these birds do have access to eat things like bugs and leafy greens while they're foraging, and bugs and leafy greens do contain a carotenoid in them that give the yolk a very specific orange tint. Now, again, this doesn't necessarily mean that these eggs are more nutrient dense than a conventional egg, but it does mean that these chickens did usually have access to foraging. Now, aside from the primary classifications of conventional, cage-free, free-range, and pasture-raised, there are also secondary classifications that are independent of the primary classifications, and one of these is something like organic. Sometimes you'll see an organic label on an egg carton, and this simply means that whatever the chicken was consuming was an organic feed. And so this can be a conventional egg, a cage-free, free-range, pasture-raised. It doesn't really matter. It just simply means that whatever the egg producers were feeding to those chickens was an organic feed, which is always good. Now, you'll also sometimes see a corn or soy-free label on an egg carton, and this simply means that obviously these eggs or these chickens haven't been fed soy or corn. And the reason this is typically a good thing is that when you refuse to feed chickens corn and soy, it encourages them and almost forces them to forage for more food, because when you give corn and soy to chickens, they typically like to over consume and overeat on that type of food material, and when you take it away, it ensures that they have to forage in order to meet their nutrient needs. Now, what this does to the egg quality typically is that it will increase the omega-3 content. Now, again, because most chickens are fed vitamin supplements, a pasture-raised and even a corn or soy-free egg doesn't typically have necessarily more nutrients, but it will have more omega-3s in it. Now, on this note, you will also sometimes see an omega-3 label on an egg carton, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's also not necessarily a good thing either. And the reason for this is that these types of eggs and these chickens that lay these eggs are typically just fed a supplement of flaxseed on top of whatever type of diet they've been given, and usually it's a conventional diet. And the reason this isn't necessarily a good thing is that flax is really high in the omega-3 fatty acid ALA. Now, the reason this isn't necessarily good is that chickens, like humans, lack the necessary enzymes to convert ALA into EPA and DHA, which means these eggs are simply high in the fatty acid ALA, which again, humans cannot convert into usable EPA and DHA. And so even though these eggs technically are higher in omega-3 fatty acids, it's really not a practical source of omega-3s. Now, with all of that being said, and to make everything even more complicated and confusing, there's actually some conventionally produced eggs that are actually more nutrient dense than pasture-raised eggs. And the reason for that is there are some companies that just simply give their chickens really, really good feed and good supplements on top of the corn and soy that they're giving them. And so even though these eggs might not have that super distinct orange tint to them, and they might not be consuming any greens or any bugs whatsoever, because of the supplements that they're getting on top of the corn and soy, a lot of times some of these eggs might actually be more nutrient dense than the pasture-raised eggs. Now, pasture-raised eggs, again, because they're getting more greens and more bugs, have a more natural nutrient distribution, which usually makes them a better option. But it is worth noting that this doesn't necessarily mean that they have more nutrients than a conventionally produced egg. Now, if you're looking for the absolute best eggs on the market, what you're going to be looking for is an organic, pasture-raised corn and soy-free egg. Now, this is going to ensure that the feed that they've been receiving is organic, but it's also going to ensure that they've been maximally exposed to foraging behavior, which is, again, not necessarily going to increase the nutrient density per se, but is going to improve the nutrient profile of the eggs that you're consuming. Now, admittedly, these eggs are pretty pricey, and so if you're not absolutely looking for the absolute best, an organic pasture-raised egg is also going to be a good option, as well as just simply pasture-raised eggs. And then beyond that, you can also opt for something like an organic free range or free range, but that's kind of typically where I personally cut it off at and don't usually dip into cage-free and conventionally produced eggs. And so I know that was super confusing, but hopefully this brought some clarity to the types of eggs that are out there and how they are classified. And hopefully you guys feel equipped now to actually know what you're looking for when it comes to buying the proper eggs at the grocery store. Now, if you guys are looking for a more hands-on approach to your dietary protocol and you feel like you need help figuring up from down and figuring out how to structure your diet in such a way as to optimize your health and your performance at the same time, please feel free to reach out to me. I do have a couple of spots still available for coaching. And so if you're interested in something like this, make sure to check out the links down below and hop on a free call with me. But other than that, I think I will see you guys next time.